We're not going to hit one of my favorite features, possibly my all-time favorite feature, period, with anything to do with Cisco, and that's ACL sequence numbers, not to be confused with numbered access lists. And we're going to see both of these in action here in a moment. Why is this one of my favorite features? Because you know that by default, when you write a line of an ACL, where is it going to be put? It's going to be put at the bottom of the list, which of course makes sense for a whole lot of reasons, right? Because you wouldn't want to go somewhere else and write your ACL out in Notepad and you've got it all ready to go, and then you come back and you put it into the router and it's there in a different order. Obviously the iOS is saying, hey, the next line you give me is going on the bottom of the list. The next line you give me is going on the bottom of the list. That's the way we want it until you realize that you need to add a line, say, somewhere else besides the bottom of your ACL. Especially if you have a permit any at the bottom, right? Because if you've denied some explicit addresses or subnets, and then you've got the permit any on the bottom, and then you've got to deny another network, then it wouldn't make any sense just to add it to the bottom, right? Because that permit any is going to permit everything, and the bottom line of the ACL never gets read. Now, that doesn't just happen in a situation where maybe you write the ACL incorrectly the first time around, you put it on the router, you don't get the result you want. What could also happen, let's say that you and I as network admins, someone comes to us and says, hey, I need these particular hosts or subnets to not be able to get to these e-commerce servers, that kind of thing. Well, you write the ACL, it works just like you wanted it to, and then that same person comes back to you 6 days later, 6 weeks later, 6 months later, and says, hey, you know what? We got some new hires over here, and they're in another part of the building, and here's where they need to be denied access to those e-commerce servers too. Well, you know, that could be a problem if you just start writing deny statements on the bottom of an ACL. Again, if you've got a permit any in there somewhere, those denies at the end of the ACL aren't going to do us any good. So in the old days and the current days, as you'll see in just a moment, it wasn't exactly rocket science what we'd have to do. We'd have to copy the ACL from the router config, put it in Notepad, make your edits, delete that ACL off the router, and then just quickly put it back on. Now, if that ACL is there for security purposes, you could have a few moments there where you don't have your ACL in place. And again, doesn't sound like the end of the world, but the less editing we have to do in that kind of clunky fashion, the better we like it. And sequence numbering really does help out with that when they're available. And what in the world do I mean by when they're available? Well, a couple of things here. First off, sequence numbers really haven't been around that long, relatively speaking. They were introduced with iOS 12.2.14s, and you could run into some lab equipment that didn't have that particular iOS. Maybe it's running an older one. That's not the worst part, though, as far as the iOS version goes. The bad part to me is when you can't use them because of the ACL type that you're creating. Because as Cisco's website documentation states, not every ACL type can use sequence numbers. And you can't use them on dynamic ACLs. Well, you know, okay, we don't write those as often as we write our regular ACL types. Reflexive ACLs, well, again, you know, lock and key ACL, maybe we don't write those that often either. Firewall ACLs, okay, you know, we don't write that many dynamic reflexive firewall ACLs every day, maybe. But then the numbered ACLs, the kind that you were originally introduced to, the kind that we've been using in this course, and you think, oh man, are you serious? You know, I can't use sequence numbers with that? Well, there is an oddity here I want you to see. It's more of a real world thing than anything else, than just theory. So I've got show access lists on this particular router, and I don't have anything pre-configured on here. Let's go ahead and configure something on here. Because let's say that someone like, say, me, heard about this great new feature called ACL Sequence Numbers. And having been through a personal trauma and once or twice in my life with ACLs, I thought I really liked that idea. So I know that my router has the iOS image that it needs to run it, and I just start sitting down and batting out some ACLs. So I'll just call this one, I'll just number this one 25, and you start using iOS help, and if you're like me, you think, well, this kind of looks like what we had before. You know, I don't see any sequence. You know, I was expecting to see SEQ here. And I didn't see anything, so I'll just go ahead and write the line here, or the ACE in Ciscoese. And 172.111, and then I put my wildcard bits. Of course, I could have just put host there, and that would have been fine. In front of the address. Well, still, one way or the other, I don't see any logs. So let's just make sure that I don't have to do something crazy like put host in front of it. Yeah, same options, right? Okay, well, I don't see anything there as far as the sequence number goes. So let's just say that I want to go ahead and finish this up. Permit any, and then I'll do a show access list and see what's up. Now, this is kind of interesting because what we've got now are some numbers here that I know darn well I didn't type, and you saw it too because we were both just right here. So I've even got witnesses this time. And we've got ACL 25, and that's all fine. Where are those numbers coming from? Well, those are the default sequence numbers. They're still going to be assigned to each line of the ACL. Again, in Ciscoese, you can call a line of an ACL an ACE, an access control entry. I just still say lines as most people do. But we've got 10 and 20, and where are those numbers coming from? Well, the sequence numbers begin with 10, and they increment by 10. So we've got 10 and 20, but we saw with iOS help that there's no way to assign a sequence number to a line in this particular ACL type. So if I had a 20-line ACL that needed a lot of editing, I would just be stuck. You know, I would just be out of luck. So I just have to do the editing thing we talked earlier about putting it over into Notepad. So let's go ahead and configure a kind of ACL that I know you can use sequence numbers with, and that is a named ACL. Remember, it's IP access list. It's a little long-winded here, so we'll use iOS help just to remind us of the options. And we're going to call this example. And I still don't see any sequence numbers, but of course we use the IP access list standard or extended command here to drop into named access control list mode. So now let's start using iOS help and take a look around. And look at that, we finally found it. Sequence number, there it is. Now, here's the thing. Don't type number and then follow it with the number you're giving it, or sequence, because it's real easy to do that when your number's like, okay, you know, sequence 15, etc. Unrecognized command. You're going to say what? Well, what you actually do here is just type the number you want to assign it, and that is it. So we're going to go ahead and write a 2-line ACL. We'll write the same one that we wrote here without specifying a sequence number and see what happens, because that is optional. See, it's working just the same as it did with the regular standard, the numbered standard list. And let's see, let's just go ahead and put host there. I like to keep with that. 111, and we're going to permit everything else. And you can see the rule still holds. We have the sequence numbers for the named access list 10 and 20. And note here, the first natural question I think is, how high can the sequence numbers go? Pretty high. I would say if you increment by 10 and you get all the way up to there, you have an unworkable access list, or you're just really good at what you do, and I congratulate you on that. Now, let's say that we do get a deny statement. Now, we need to go back and add a deny for 210.111. Well, let me ask you, what number would you recommend we use for that? It's not a trick question. We know the range that we could use, but what number would you suggest we use? I personally would suggest we use 15. Now, we could use anything from 11 through 19, but here's what I have found to be the case in the real world. There's nothing wrong with putting another line in here as 11 or 19, because either one of them are going to be placed between 10 and 20. But let's say that I come to you with one address that needs to be denied, and you deny it with 11. And then for some reason, whatever I come back with has to be placed between 10 and 11 for your ACL to work correctly. Boy, that's something, right? Because, you know, I could come to you and say, hey, I want you to put a deny statement in for this particular subnet. but then I want you to permit this one particular address from that subnet. And if you had already entered that deny statement as line 11 or as sequence number 11, then you couldn't put that permit in between 10 and 11. This isn't horse racing where they can put, 1A out there. We don't have a 10A or a 10.1 or anything like that. So again, it's not a hard and fast rule, but when you start editing an ACL with sequence numbers, I would leave myself some room in between the numbers if I were you. So what we'll do on the very next video is pick up exactly where we are here. We'll enter that line for 15 and we'll talk about this sequence number just a little bit more. I'll see you there.